The woman who saved his life was never supposed to matter. She was not written into any will. She had no shares in any company, no seat at any table, no title beyond the one stitched into the plain uniform she wore every morning before the sun had finished rising over Lagos. She was the maid. She swept the floors of a man worth more money than most people in her neighborhood would ever see in 10 lifetimes. She washed dishes, she ironed shirts. She kept the house of Kelvin Okafor, billionaire, patriarch, and the kind of man that God seems to make only once per generation, running like a quiet, well-oiled machine. That was her world, small, defined, unseen, but it was precisely because she was unseen that she saw everything. And what she saw was going to cost a very beautiful woman her freedom and save Kelvin his life. This is that story, and before it is over, you will never again look at the people who serve you the same way. Welcome to Wealthra Stories, where every tale reveals what wealth exposes about character, what hardship teaches about strength, and why the smallest acts of courage echo the loudest. If you love stories that stay with you, hit that subscribe button right now and turn on your notification bell so you never miss an upload. Drop a comment below telling me where you're watching from. Let us go back. Let us go all the way back to the beginning, to the Lagos that Kelvin built for himself, not just in wealth, but in spirit, because a man's true home is not his property, it is his peace. And for many years, Kelvin had both in abundance. He was not one of those men who wore money like armor, who drove through traffic in convoys and needed the whole world to see them coming. No, Kelvin's wealth was the quiet kind, the kind that does not announce itself but fills every room it enters. The compound in Ikoyi was immaculate and enormous, surrounded by bougainvillea that bloomed in colors you would only believe if you saw them yourself. The cars in the garage were the kind that engineers dream about. The furniture had been chosen by someone who understood the difference between luxury and taste, and had wisely chosen taste. Everything in that house was exactly what it needed to be, no more, no less. That was Kelvin, precise, purposeful. And at the center of it all, deeply, almost stubbornly, human. He had built his fortune in oil logistics and real estate across 3 decades of disciplined sacrifice. The kind of sacrifice that most people talk about, but very few actually understand. He had started with almost nothing, a young man from Anambra with a first-class degree, a stubbornness that frightened even his closest friends, and a hunger so focused it could cut glass. By his mid-30s, he had signed his first government contract. By his 40s, he was a name that other powerful men said carefully, the way you say the name of something you respect and do not want to offend. By 50, Kelvin needed no introduction in any room in Nigeria, and quite a few rooms outside it. But here is what the newspapers never printed, what the Forbes profiles never captured, what the envy of lesser men always missed. Kelvin's greatest investment was never a deal. It was a woman named Mary. Mary was his wife of 22 years. His partner in every sense of that word. The quiet strategist behind half his best decisions. The warmth that kept the machine from turning cold, the laughter in the house that made success feel like it was worth something. She gave him a son, Emmanuel, who grew up watching his father with wide, serious eyes and eventually became the kind of young man his father was proud to look at. Emmanuel had inherited Kelvin's discipline and Mary's gentleness, a rare combination, and when he left for the United Kingdom to pursue his doctorate, both his parents had watched the departure lounge swallow him up, and stood there a little longer than they needed to, because that is what parents do. They were, by every honest measure, a happy home. And then Mary got sick. The details do not matter, not here, not now, because grief does not need details to be understood. What matters is what that kind of loss does to a man like Kelvin. What it does to a man who has spent his whole life building and protecting and providing, when the thing he loved most, the thing no amount of money could touch, is taken from him anyway. What it does is this. It leaves him standing in the middle of everything he built with the sudden vertiginous realization that he built it all for someone, and that someone is gone. The house in Ikoyi did not change. The bougainvillea still bloomed. The cars were still there. The furniture still understood the difference between luxury and taste. But the house became quieter in a way that had nothing to do with sound. It became the kind of quiet that presses against you, that follows you from room to room, that sits at the other end of the dining table and eats in silence. Kelvin grieved privately, methodically, and for a very long time. He threw himself into work the way men of his generation do, not as healing, but as hiding. He flew to Abuja, to Port Harcourt, to Accra, to London. He signed deals. He expanded the portfolio. He gave speeches at industry dinners and received awards with a steady smile and firm handshake, and returned to Lagos and climbed the stairs of the Ikoyi house and stood in the corridor outside the bedroom that had been theirs for 22 years. And he was, in every way that mattered, alone. But he was not entirely alone. There was Ada. Ada Chukwu had come to work in Kelvin's house 6 years before Mary's passing, recommended by a distant relative who had worked in a similar household and spoke well of her. She was in her late 20s then, compact, efficient, with a face that was not remarkable until it was, until you caught her watching something with those quiet, fathomless eyes and realized there was considerably more happening behind them than she would ever volunteer. She came from Enugu, from the kind of family where hard work was not a virtue, but simply a fact of life, like weather. She knew how to be in a room without disturbing it. She knew when to speak and, far more importantly, when not to. She was exactly what a household like this needed, invisible in the best sense of the word, present in all the ways that counted. Most wealthy men in Kelvin's position would not have known their maid's full name, let alone her story. Kelvin was not most wealthy men. He knew that Ada sent money home every month to her mother in Enugu. He knew she was saving, slowly and faithfully, for something she had not yet told anyone about. He knew she took her tea without sugar and that she had a laugh she tried to hide because she thought it was too loud, which it was, and which was one of the more honest things about her. He knew these things not because he pried, but because he paid attention. He paid attention to the people around him the way some men tend their gardens, regularly, without drama, because he understood that living things need tending. He called her by her name. He asked about her mother. On the occasional quiet Sunday afternoon, when the house was particularly still and neither of them had anywhere urgent to be, he would sit at the kitchen counter with a cup of tea while Ada prepared something, and they would talk. Not about anything momentous, just the easy, unhurried conversation of two people who have learned to trust each other's company. He would tell her about a meeting that had gone badly or a piece of land he was considering, and she would listen with that steady attention of hers and occasionally say something so precisely correct that he would pause and look at her and think, not for the first time, that Ada was one of the smarter people he knew and that life had simply placed her here, in this house, in this uniform, which said everything about life and nothing about her. For Ada, Kelvin's decency was not small. You must understand, in a country where domestic workers are so often treated as furniture, as background noise, as convenient ghosts who appear and disappear on command, to be seen, genuinely seen, by the man whose floors you sweep is not a small thing. It becomes the foundation of something. And what it became, in Ada, was loyalty of the deepest and most uncalculated kind, not the loyalty of obligation, the loyalty of a person who has been treated well and therefore refuses to look away. This was the world of Kelvin. This was the atmosphere of the house in Ikoyi in those years of quiet grief. This was what existed before everything changed, before the storm arrived, wearing a smile so beautiful it would make you forget to watch the sky. 3 years after Mary's death, Kelvin began to live again. It happened slowly at first, the way dawn happens, not in one sudden moment, but in a gradual, almost reluctant brightening. Friends began to pull him back into social life. He accepted an invitation to a charity gala in Victoria Island, the kind of event he would normally have sent a check to and avoided in person. He went. He sat at a table full of people whose names he knew from the business pages and found himself genuinely laughing at something one of them said. He drove home that night and noticed, with something almost like surprise, that the quiet in the house felt slightly different, less heavy, like a window had been opened somewhere. It was at a private dinner party, 2 months later, that he met Chioma. She came into the room and the room rearranged itself around her. That is the only accurate way to describe it. Chioma was 34 years old and constructed, it seemed, by someone who understood beauty as a strategic instrument. She was tall, with the kind of figure that tailors thank God for, curves that moved with a liquid, unhurried confidence, skin the color of dark honey, a smile that arrived slowly and departed even more slowly, as if it was doing you a favor by staying as long as it did. She wore a gown that was simple and devastating in equal measure. She laughed at the right moments. She listened with her whole body. She touched your arm when she made a point, and when she pulled away, you noticed the absence. Kelvin had been negotiating contracts for 30 years. He knew what performance looked like. He had sat across from the best actors in Nigerian business, men who could project sincerity the way others project PowerPoint slides. And he had seen through every single one of them. He did not see through Chioma. Not that night. She was introduced to him by the host, a mutual friend who mentioned Kelvin's name and watched Chioma's face for the flicker of recognition that everyone's face showed. And Chioma's face did something more interesting than recognition. It showed interest. Not in the money, or so it seemed. Interest in him. In the lines around his eyes. In the careful, considered way he spoke. She asked him questions that no one at these dinners ever asked him. Not about the business, not about the portfolio, not about the Forbes ranking. She asked him what he was reading. She asked him whether he missed anything about the early days, when everything was uncertain. She asked him, with a directness that was almost startling, whether he considered himself a happy man. He drove home and sat in the car outside the Ikoyi house for 4 minutes before going in. Ada saw him from the window. She noticed the particular quality of his stillness. She had seen Kelvin in many moods over 6 years, tired, elated, grieving, focused, angry, gentle. This was a new one. This was a man whose mind was somewhere else, and whose somewhere else had a woman's face. Ada noted it. She said nothing. She went back to what she was doing. They courted for 5 months. 5 months is not long. Kelvin, who took 3 years to decide on a piece of land, who read every clause of every contract twice before initialing, who had once renegotiated the terms of a partnership over one sentence in paragraph 14. This same man courted Chioma for 5 months and proposed on the 6th. His close friends said very little, which was its own kind of statement. Emmanuel called from London. The conversation was warm but careful, the way conversations between fathers and sons are when the son has questions he is not yet ready to ask. Kelvin heard the questions anyway. He told Emmanuel that he was not replacing his mother, that he was not forgetting, that he was only trying to find a way to keep living, which was what Mary would have wanted. Emmanuel said he understood. He may have meant it. The wedding was everything Chioma deserved. That is the way it appeared, as though this woman had been waiting her whole life to arrive at exactly this moment, in exactly this dress, in exactly this life. She walked down the aisle with the grace of someone fulfilling a destiny, and Kelvin waited at the altar with the open, unguarded face of a man who has decided to trust the world one more time. Ada watched from the back of the venue, in the section where the household staff sat with the caterers and the drivers. She watched Chioma's face as Kelvin slipped the ring onto her finger. She watched the tears that appeared in Chioma's eyes at the exact right moment. She watched the way Chioma looked at Kelvin, with warmth, with wonder, with what appeared to be profound and genuine love. Ada had been watching faces her whole life. She watched Chioma's face and felt, beneath the warmth of the ceremony, beneath the music and the joy and the relief of seeing her employer happy again, a small, cold current. Like finding ice at the bottom of a warm drink. She did not know what it meant. She could not prove anything. She told herself she was being unfair, that she was projecting, that grief could make even an observer suspicious of happiness. She went home. She set the wedding reception leftovers in the refrigerator. She said a prayer for the new couple. She went to bed. She did not sleep well. The honeymoon was in the Maldives. 12 days. Kelvin sent Ada a brief message to let her know when to expect them back, because that was the kind of man he was, the kind who told the people in his house what was happening so they did not have to wonder. Ada prepared the house meticulously, fresh flowers in the entrance hall. The guest suite aired and ready for when Emmanuel eventually visited. Every surface spotless, every corner attended to, because this was a new beginning and it deserved to be received properly. They came home on a Tuesday. Chioma walked through the door of the Ikoyi house as its new mistress, and something about the atmosphere changed in a way that Ada could not immediately name. It was not visible. It was not audible. It was the way a room feels when the pressure changes just before a storm, not the storm itself, but the knowledge of the storm lodged somewhere in the body before the mind has caught up. Chioma was warm to Kelvin. Demonstratively warm. The kind of warmth that fills a room because it needs to fill a room. She redecorated parts of the house with an energy that Kelvin found flattering and endearing. She joined him at breakfast and sent him off to his meetings with a kiss and the right words and a smile that was still doing him favors by staying as long as it did. She posted carefully chosen photographs on social media that told a story of domestic bliss so polished it looked editorial. She was, to all appearances, the perfect second chapter. And then Kelvin would leave. The gate would close behind his convoy, the sound of the engines would fade down the road, and Chioma would stand in the entrance hall of the Ikoyi house, and the smile would go out like a candle. Ada saw it happen the first time, 4 days after the honeymoon. She was coming from the utility room with a basket of freshly folded linen when she heard the convoy leave, and then, 3 seconds later, heard the quality of the house change. She turned a corner and nearly walked into Chioma, who was standing in the corridor with a face Ada had not seen before. Not angry, not cold, simply real, as if the performance had a runtime and the runtime had ended. Chioma looked at Ada for a long, measured moment, and then she walked away without a word. Ada stood there holding the linen. She noted what she had seen the way a scientist notes an anomaly. Carefully, without rushing to conclusions, but without dismissing it either. It happened again. And again. And again. A pattern has a way of making itself visible once you are paying attention. And Ada was always paying attention. When Kelvin was home, the house had a certain music to it. Chioma laughing, Chioma asking about the meetings, Chioma touching his arm, Chioma sending for Ada with small, reasonable requests delivered in a voice sweet enough to have no edge. The moment he left, the music stopped. Not gradually, immediately. Like a switch. The requests became orders. The reasonableness evaporated. Ada would be in the middle of a task, and Chioma would appear and redirect her to another one without explanation. And when Ada finished, that one would appear again and redirect her to something else, as though the goal were not to have the tasks completed, but to keep Ada perpetually off balance, perpetually in motion, perpetually uncertain of what she was supposed to be doing. It was a particular kind of cruelty, the kind that leaves no marks, the kind that cannot be reported, the kind that is designed specifically to make the person experiencing it feel like they are imagining it. But Ada was not imagining it. She noticed also what Chioma was doing to her access to Kelvin. Before the marriage, Kelvin and Ada's occasional conversations had been a quiet rhythm in the house, natural, unremarkable, simply part of the texture of daily life. Now those conversations were quietly being closed down. Chioma always seemed to appear when Kelvin and Ada were in the same room, not dramatically, not accusingly, just present, filling the space, redirecting Kelvin's attention, finding a reason to need him elsewhere. Slowly, without any single incident that could be pointed to, the easy communication between Kelvin and his maid was being reduced. A sentence where there had been a conversation, a nod where there had been a sentence. Distance measured out in careful spoonfuls. Ada recognized what was happening. Someone was building a wall between her and the only person in this house who would listen if she ever needed to speak. She prayed about it. She told God what she was seeing and asked for wisdom, because what she was seeing was not proof of anything. It was a feeling. A pattern. A cold current under warm water. You cannot go to a billionaire with a feeling. You cannot walk into the office of Kelvin, who has looked across negotiating tables at the canniest businessmen on the continent, and tell him that his new wife smiles differently when he is in the room. He would thank you, politely and firmly, and that would be the end of things. So Ada watched, and she waited. and she kept the house running and said good morning to Chioma with a steady face and prayed every night with the focused urgency of someone who suspects they are running out of time. She did not know yet that she was right. She did not know yet that 3,000 kilometers away in London, Emmanuel Okafor was putting the final pages of his doctoral thesis in order. She did not know that his defense was scheduled. She did not know that within months, Emmanuel would be returning to Nigeria. The heir, the son, the next chapter of the Okafor legacy, and that this information had reached Chioma like a lit match in a room full of curtains. She did not know any of that yet. She only knew that the air in the Ikoyi house had changed, that the peace she had lived inside for 6 years, the peace she had helped to build and maintain through grief and reconstruction and new beginnings, was becoming something else, something calculated, something that watched the gate for the convoy and switched itself off and on accordingly. She only knew that the woman sleeping in Mary Okafor's bed was not what she appeared to be, but she could not prove it. Not yet. So here is the question that should sit with you right now, in the place where real thinking happens. Not the comfortable surface of the mind, but somewhere deeper, somewhere honest. If you were Ada, what would you do? You have no proof. You have no power. You have no allies, because the one person who might believe you is the one person you can barely reach anymore. You have only your eyes, your instincts, and the knowledge that the woman in charge of this house wears a different face behind closed doors. You have the sense, bone deep, unshakable, that something is coming, that this is not a domestic inconvenience but a genuine threat, that the kindness this man showed you for 6 years is the only currency you have, and you had better spend it wisely, and you had better spend it soon. What do you do? And perhaps more importantly, why is it always the person that no one watches who ends up seeing everything that everyone else missed? Ada did not sleep the night she made her decision. She lay on her back in the small room at the rear of the Ikoyi compound, the room that was hers, that had always been hers, with its single window that caught the night breeze off the lagoon and its walls that had absorbed 6 years of her prayers and her silences and her private thoughts. And she stared at the ceiling and she made a choice, not a loud choice, not a dramatic one. The most consequential decisions rarely announce themselves. They arrive quietly, in the dark, in the body before they reach the mind, and you recognize them not by how they sound, but by how they feel, certain and a little frightening, and completely unavoidable. She would act. She did not yet know how, but she would act. That resolution sat in her chest like a coal, small, hot, patient. And she carried it through the next days with the same composed face she always wore. Because Ada Chukwu had learned long ago that the most powerful thing a woman in her position could do was to let people continue underestimating her. She swept the floors. She prepared the meals. She answered when Chioma called and moved when Chioma redirected her and kept her eyes cast at a respectful distance whenever the two of them were in the same room. She was, to all appearances, exactly what Chioma believed her to be. A woman of modest means and modest ambitions, loyal to routine, incapable of strategy. She was none of those things. She was watching, she was calculating. She was building, inside her quiet mind, a case. Not a legal case, not yet, because she still had no proof of anything concrete, but a case in the older sense of the word. An argument. A structure of observations so precise and so consistent that even a man trained to resist manipulation would eventually have to look at it and see what she saw. She was not going to go to Kelvin with feelings. She was going to go to him with something he could not dismiss. She just needed the right door, and right now the door is about to open. Ada had set the dining table, she had laid the cloth, she had placed the settings, she had arranged everything with the care she always brought to the smallest tasks, and she had left to attend to something in the kitchen. Ordinary, routine, exactly the way an ordinary Tuesday evening unfolded in the Okafor household. And then, from somewhere in the house, she heard a sound. Not a crash, not an alarm, something quieter and therefore worse. The particular silence that follows a movement that was not meant to be heard. She walked back towards the dining room, and she stopped outside the door, and she looked through the gap, and she saw Chioma. Chioma was standing over the food that had been set for Kelvin. Her back was to the door. Her movements were quick and precise and practiced in a way that made Ada's blood cool from the inside out. Because there is a specific horror in watching someone do something terrible with the fluency of someone who has done it many times before or has rehearsed it so thoroughly that they have. Chioma reached into the pocket of her robe. She removed something small. She moved it over the food with the brief, expert efficiency of a surgeon. She straightened. She turned. She left. And then everything accelerated into the sequence Ada had already seen in her waking nightmare, the one she had played out in her own mind a dozen times in the preceding weeks, the scenario she feared most. She ran to the dining room. She called out. Kelvin arrived, and she stood between him and the table, and she said the words she had to say. "This food has been poisoned. Please do not eat. Please listen to me." And Chioma appeared, and the smile appeared, and the voice appeared. That particular voice, warm and reasonable and subtly devastating, and what Chioma said was this: that it was very interesting, wasn't it? That the only person who had been alone in this dining room before the master of the house arrived was the maid herself. That it was very interesting that Ada, who had for months seemed uncomfortable with the changes in this household, had chosen this evening to raise such a dramatic accusation. That it was very interesting indeed. And Kelvin's face changed. Ada watched it change the way you watch weather change, rapidly, completely, with nothing you can do to stop it. The warmth became suspicion, the trust became distance. He looked at Ada the way you look at a stranger, the way you look at someone you have just decided you do not know. Kelvin picked up his phone and called the police, and Ada knelt down in fear to beg Kelvin, and that was when she woke up in fear, panting and even more scared than she was in the dream. She had fallen asleep in the chair in her room, not intentionally, the way exhaustion sometimes takes you before you have decided to let it. And the dream came not like most dreams come, fragmentary and nonsensical and already dissolving by the time you reach for them. This dream came with the full, horrible clarity of something that is trying to tell you something important and has very little time to do it. She woke up. She was in the chair in her room. The window was still catching the night breeze. The lagoon was out there in the dark, indifferent and eternal. Her heart was doing something violent in her chest, and her hands were gripping the arms of the chair with a force she had not been conscious of applying. She sat there and she breathed. 1 breath, 2, 3. She let the dream settle around her like sediment. It was a dream, but here is what Ada Chukwu understood. Sitting in that chair at whatever hour the night had become. A dream is not always just a dream. Sometimes it is your mind, which is cleverer than you give it credit for, running a simulation, testing a scenario, showing you what happens if you do the thing you were thinking of doing, the direct and obvious thing, the thing that feels righteous in the moment but plays directly into the hands of someone who is already prepared for it. The dream was not prophecy. The dream was a warning. Do not go to him with words. Words can be turned against you. Do not go to him with accusations. Accusations without proof are not weapons. They are gifts, handed directly to the person you are accusing. Go to him with something she cannot touch. Go to him with something she cannot explain away. Go to him with evidence. Ada sat in that chair until the first grey light began to ease through the window. Then she got up, washed her face, straightened her uniform, and waited for the day to begin. She was not afraid anymore. Fear had been replaced by something more useful. Purpose, focused to a point so fine it could cut. Kelvin arrived home that evening at 6:30. Ada had been listening for the convoy since 5. She heard the gates open and she moved, not hurriedly, not obviously, but with the quiet intention of someone who knows exactly what they need to do and has thought through every step. She was at the gate when the lead car pulled in. Not inside the house. At the gate. That detail mattered. That detail said, "This cannot wait, and I did not want to have this conversation inside those walls." Kelvin saw her and slowed. Something in her face made him slow. He had known Ada Chukwu for 6 years, and he had learned over those years to read the gradations of her expression. Not because he studied her, but because he paid attention, the way he paid attention to everything that mattered. The face she was wearing now was one he had never seen before. It was not distress exactly. It was not urgency exactly. It was something beneath both of those things, something foundational. The look of a person who has moved beyond emotion into pure necessity. He lowered the car window. Ada said, "Sir, I need 5 minutes. Please, in the car." Inside the convoy, the driver looked straight ahead. Kelvin held Ada's gaze for 2 seconds. Then he opened the door and stepped out, and they got into the second car, the one that was always kept for private business, and the driver of that car got the look that meant, step out, close the door, stand at a distance. Kelvin was a man who had handled enough sensitive matters to know when sensitive matter was being handed to him. They sat in the back seat with the engine off and the tinted windows holding the world at a distance, and Ada began to speak. And here is where she proved herself not just loyal but brilliant, because she did not tell him about the dream. She did not tell him about the cold current she felt every time Chioma walked through a room. She did not tell him about the face that appeared when the convoy left and disappeared when it returned. She gave him none of that because she had dreamed the outcome of that conversation and she would not live it in waking life. Instead, she told him about rats. She told him calmly, practically, professionally, the way you report a domestic matter to an employer, that she believed there may be rodents accessing the dining area, possibly through the utilities passage, and that given the sensitivity of the space where food was prepared and served, she would strongly recommend a monitoring camera be installed. Hidden, she added. Hidden cameras were more effective for this kind of assessment because if the rats knew the camera was there, and here she kept her face completely straight, they would simply use a different route. The camera needed to be where no one expected it, and it needed to be a matter known only to him. No one else. Not the other staff. Not, she added, looking at him with eyes that were calm but doing considerable work beneath the surface. Not even Madame. Kelvin looked at her. The silence in the car was of the specific kind that follows a statement that could mean one thing on the surface and something else entirely underneath, and both parties know it, but neither one is ready to name the second thing directly. He laughed and said, with the reasonable skepticism of a man who has managed large operations and is not easily redirected by intuition, "Ada, this is a house, not a warehouse. I think we can handle rats with a trap." She said, "Sir, these are not ordinary rats. And the more reason I suggested a hidden camera that no one knows about because this is more than you think. It is complicated and can only be better if you witnessed this yourself." And then she said, "This is between life and death. I know what I am talking about, but you will understand it better when you witness it yourself. Please. Just the camera. Just the dining room. Just for a short time. Tell no one." The silence returned. It lasted longer this time. Kelvin was looking at this woman who had been in his house for 6 years, who had known Mary, who had managed his household through grief and transition with a steadiness he had come to rely on, more than he had ever stated openly. And he was making a calculation. Not about rats. He was past rats. He was calculating something else, something that sat at the intersection of trust and instinct, and the particular intelligence of a man who has learned, sometimes painfully, that the people closest to you see things that your own desire for peace can blind you to. He got out of the car without another word. He went inside. He greeted Chioma, who received him with the usual warmth, the usual questions about the day, the usual performance of a marriage in full bloom. He ate a light dinner. He made some calls. He went to his study. The next morning, a technician arrived to service the home network, or so the paperwork said. By that afternoon, a camera no larger than a shirt button occupied a position in the dining room that provided a clean, unobstructed view of the table and the access points to it. Kelvin had told no one, not his PA, not his security chief, not Chioma. He had moved with the discretion of a man who has spent decades making decisions that other people did not need to know about until the right moment. He synced the feed to a private folder on his phone. He looked at it once that night, saw the empty dining room, silver and still in the night vision filter, and put his phone down. He told himself he was doing this to satisfy Ada's concern. He told himself it would come to nothing. He almost believed it. The camera watched. The house moved around it, unconscious of its presence. Chioma rearranged flowers in the living room. The house staff moved through their routines. Kelvin came and went. Ada prepared meals and served them and cleared up afterwards and gave no indication, none at all, that anything had changed or that anything was pending. She prayed each night with the intensity of someone who has planted a seed and is asking God to tend it while they wait. 1 day passed. 2. 3. The dining room camera saw nothing it was not supposed to see. Kelvin checked the feed each morning with the decreasing attention of a man who is becoming convinced he is watching an empty stage. By day 4, he had stopped checking before noon. By day 5, he was checking once in the evening, briefly, the way you check a weather app when you no longer really expect rain. By day 6, the thought had formed, solidly and with conviction, that he needed to remove the camera and have a very clear conversation with Ada about the difference between genuine concern and unfounded suspicion. He was, in fact, preparing to do exactly this when his phone rang. The call was from Port Harcourt. A contract matter, time-sensitive, requiring his immediate attention, requiring him to be in the car and on a video call within 10 minutes. He stood up from his desk and moved and forgot, in the clean sweep of urgent business, that he had been about to go to the dining room and retrieve a small camera from behind a decorative panel. It stayed where it was. He drove to his meeting. He returned late. He slept. The next morning arrived. Ada prepared breakfast for Kelvin with the unhurried precision that characterized everything she did. She set the table. She arranged the food. She stepped back and looked at what she had made, and then she left the dining room, the way she always did, quietly, without announcement, disappearing back into the rhythms of the house as though she had never been there at all. Kelvin came down a few minutes later. He moved through the corridor with his phone in his hand, the easy, unhurried pace of a man following a routine so familiar it requires no thought. He pushed open the dining room door. He sat. He looked at the food in front of him, arranged as always with Ada's particular care, and he picked up his spoon and leaned forward and was within one breath, one single motion, of bringing it to his mouth. The door burst open. Ada stood in the doorway, and the voice that came out of her was not the voice of a composed woman choosing her words carefully. It was the voice of someone who had run out of time for careful. She said, "Sir, please, do not eat that food. Check the camera first. Please, sir, check the camera." The spoon stopped in mid-air. Kelvin turned and looked at her. She was standing in the doorway with her chest rising and falling and her eyes carrying something he had never seen in them before. Not panic exactly, but the concentrated urgency of someone who knows something and needs him to believe it before another second passes. From somewhere behind them, Chioma's voice arrived, bright, immediate, and wrapped in the particular warmth she reserved for moments that required managing. She said, "Which camera?" Nobody answered her. Kelvin looked at Ada for one more second. Then he looked down at his phone. He opened the folder. He pressed play on the most recent footage, and he watched. The timestamp was from the previous evening. The dining room, empty. And then, not empty. A figure entering from the side passage, moving with the quiet fluency of someone operating in a space they consider entirely private, entirely safe. The quality of the movement alone was enough to stop the breath in your chest, not furtive, not fearful, but deliberate. Practiced. The movement of someone who has thought this through and is now simply executing. The figure reached into the folds of a garment, removed something, held it over the prepared food. A pause of approximately 4 seconds. Then the hand withdrew. The figure straightened and turned. The face the camera captured was perfectly clear. Later, those who knew Kelvin well would say that what happened next was one of the most extraordinary things they had ever witnessed in a man of his composure. He did not raise his voice. He did not break anything. He did not confront. He stood with his phone in his hand, and he was very, very still, in the way that only men who have mastered themselves are still. Not the stillness of shock, but the stillness of someone absorbing something enormous and choosing, with full consciousness, what to do next. He made one phone call. The police arrived within 40 minutes. They were plain clothes. They entered through the side entrance with the quiet efficiency of men who had been briefed on what they were coming for and did not need to perform the drama of their arrival. Chioma was in the living room. She looked up when they appeared in the doorway, and the smile arrived automatically. the trained reflex of a woman who has answered every situation with charm. And then something in the faces of the men in the doorway reached her, and the smile did the thing it had never done before in this house. It failed. At the station, Chioma held her composure for longer than anyone expected. She was, it must be said, exceptional at this, at maintaining the surface when the structure beneath it was crumbling. She answered questions with the measured patience of someone who is very confident that this is all a misunderstanding that will resolve itself shortly. She requested her phone. She asked for water. She kept her voice at the exact register of dignified indignation. Not too loud, which would seem panicked. Not too quiet, which would seem defeated. She was, even here, performing. And then the detective placed the phone on the table and pressed play. He let the footage run without comment. He did not narrate it. He did not editorialize. He simply let the camera tell the story it had been quietly recording in the dining room of the Ikoyi house, and he watched Chioma's face as she watched herself. And there, in the small windowless room, with the sounds of the station pressing through the walls, the performance ended. What came out was not remorse, not immediately. What came out first was the particular silence of someone recalculating, assessing the evidence against them with the same cold precision they brought to everything else, determining that the mathematics of denial no longer added up, and making a pragmatic pivot. Chioma was, if nothing else, intelligent. She understood when a position was untenable. She understood the difference between a negotiation that could still be won and one that had already been decided. She folded not because she was broken, but because she was practical, and the practical conclusion was the same regardless of how long she held out. She confessed. The full picture that emerged in that room was considerably larger than a single act of poisoning. Chioma had not married Kelvin in a moment of desperate opportunity. This had been architecture, deliberate, researched, patient architecture. She had been introduced to Kelvin's social circle through a contact she had cultivated specifically for this purpose. A person who attended the same events, who could provide access, who could make the introduction feel organic and coincidental. The 5 months of courtship had not been 5 months of love. They had been 5 months of reconnaissance. Learning the house, learning his patterns, learning the location of documents, understanding the financial architecture, identifying the access points that would matter later. The affection had been a tool, precisely calibrated, never wasted. Her boyfriend, Emeka, who was, at this moment, at a house across the city waiting for a message that was not going to come, had been the architect of the broader scheme. They had been together for 4 years before Chioma entered Kelvin's circle. Emeka was the mind. Chioma was the execution. The plan had been to secure enough sensitive documentation and financial access to make a transfer and a disappearance viable. They had come close, closer than Kelvin knew. The acceleration, the move from patient to urgent, had happened when Chioma learned about Emmanuel. When she understood that the son was finishing his degree and returning to take his place in his father's legacy, the window she had been working within became suddenly much smaller. An heir in residence would mean more eyes, more involvement, more scrutiny of things that had been quiet. She had needed to move faster. She had moved faster, and in moving faster, she had moved into the frame of a camera she had not known was there. Emeka was arrested at the house across the city within the hour. He came quietly, which said everything about him. They were both charged. The wheels of consequence, once set in motion, moved with an efficiency that the scheme itself had never quite managed. And in the Ikoyi compound, in the aftermath of a day that had rearranged everything, Kelvin sat in his study with a cup of tea that was going cold and thought about what he knew and what he had missed, and how close, how genuinely, terrifyingly close, he had come to never knowing any of it. He thought about the dining room camera. He thought about the conversation in the car. He thought about a woman who had come to him with a story about rats because she understood, with a precision that still astonished him, that he would not have believed the truth. He thought about 6 years, about tea at the kitchen counter, about easy Sunday conversations, about a name he had always used, and a laugh he had always found honest, and a steadiness he had always relied on without ever pausing to ask himself what it cost her to maintain it. He thought about Mary, who had been kind to everyone in this house and who had, without ever stating it as policy, taught him to be the same way. And he understood, sitting alone in the wreckage and the rescue of this single day, what had actually happened. Not just the scheme, not just the camera. The thing beneath all of it, the thing that made the difference between a story where he died and a story where he did not. He had been good to the right person, not strategically. Not with any calculation, simply because it was the right way to be. And that person had been watching over him in return, without being asked, without reward, without any certainty that it would matter, because that is what genuine loyalty does. It does not wait to be needed. It pays attention always, just in case. So here is the question. Not a comfortable one, the kind of question that follows you home and sits with you in the quiet. How many people in your life have you walked past, day after day, without really seeing them? How many of the people who serve you, who maintain the spaces you move through, who are present at the edges of your world in ways you consider unremarkable, how many of them are seeing things about your life that you cannot see yourself? And more than that, have you been the kind of person who makes them want to speak up when it matters? Or have you been the kind of person who has made certain, without meaning to, that they would rather stay silent? Because Ada spoke, but only because Kelvin had made it possible for her to speak. And had he not, had he been the other kind of man, the kind who looks through the people who serve him, who forgets their names by the end of the first week, who treats kindness as a luxury for people who have the leisure for it, Ada would have had her dream, and her instinct, and her certainty, and she would have kept it entirely to herself, and Kelvin would have eaten his breakfast. He did not sleep the night after Chioma was taken in. He sat in the study until the house settled into the particular silence of very late hours. And then he moved through the rooms slowly, not restlessly, not in the agitated way of a man who cannot contain what he is feeling, but in the deliberate way of someone taking inventory. He walked through the dining room and stood at the table and looked at the chair where he would have sat. He walked to the kitchen and stood in the doorway. He walked to the entrance hall where the fresh flowers Ada always arranged stood in their vase, already beginning to bow their heads slightly, the way flowers do when they have been cut from something living. He stood there for a long time. He was not counting his losses. He was counting what remained. Emmanuel called from London the following morning. The news had reached him through channels that moved faster than any official notification, a friend of a friend, a message, a fragment of information that was enough to make a son dial his father's number before he had fully decided what he was going to say. The call lasted over an hour. It began carefully, the way these calls begin when there is too much to say and neither party knows which thread to pull first. And then, somewhere in the middle of it, the carefulness dissolved. Kelvin talked to his son the way he had not talked to him since Mary died, openly, without the protective editing that grief teaches fathers to apply when they do not want their children to see them diminished. He told Emmanuel what had happened, all of it. He told him about the months of Chioma's performance. He told him about Ada's warning. He told him about the camera and the footage and the stillness that had come over him in the corridor when he understood what he was watching. And Emmanuel, who had his father's discipline and his mother's gentleness, and who had been carrying his own quiet concerns about his father's remarriage across an ocean and through 4 time zones, listened to all of it. And when Kelvin was done, there was a pause on the line, and then Emmanuel said something that his father would think about for a long time afterwards. He said, "Dad, the reason Ada said something is the same reason Mum always made sure you knew the names of everyone who worked for you." He said nothing else. He did not need to. Emmanuel came home 3 weeks later. Not just for a visit, he came home. The thesis was done. The defense had been completed with the quiet distinction of someone who had always known exactly what he was doing and had simply needed the time to do it properly. He landed at Murtala Mohammed Airport on a Tuesday morning with 2 suitcases and the particular expression of a man who has been away long enough to understand the precise value of what he left behind. Kelvin met him at the arrivals hall, not with a driver, not with a PA, just himself, standing near the barrier the way fathers stand when they are trying not to show how much they have been waiting. Emmanuel saw him, and the expression changed into something that had no name, but needed none. They drove home together through Lagos traffic, and for long stretches neither of them spoke. Because sometimes the fullest kind of communication is the kind that does not require language. The city moved around them, chaotic, brilliant, impossible, alive, and the Okafor men sat in it together and let the silence say what they could not yet put into words. At the house, Ada had prepared a meal. Not an elaborate one, not a celebratory feast constructed to mark an occasion. Simply a good meal, made with attention, the kind of food that tastes like someone cared about the person who would eat it. She set the table with the same quiet precision she brought to everything, and then she withdrew, because she understood instinctively that this reunion needed space and not an audience. Kelvin called her back. He called her name from the dining room, and she came to the doorway and he said, "Sit down, Ada." She looked at him and then at Emmanuel, who was watching her with the serious eyes that were exactly his father's, and she sat. And the three of them ate together at that table, the billionaire, the heir and the maid, in what was perhaps the most honest meal that house had ever contained. They talked about small things at first, the food, Emmanuel's journey, the traffic on the expressway. And then gradually the conversation shifted to larger things. The way river water shifts when it moves from shallow to deep, not abruptly, but inevitably. Kelvin talked about Mary. He talked about her in the easy, present tense way that people speak of the dead when they have finally made their peace with the loss. Not with grief, but with something steadier and more permanent. Emmanuel talked about his research and what he planned to do with it, and the ideas he had carried through 4 years abroad that were now ready to be tested in the soil they were intended for. And Ada listened and occasionally spoke, and was, for the first time in a very long time, simply herself in that house, not performing invisibility, not managing distance, not holding anything back. It was, by every honest measure, a good evening. In the weeks that followed, Kelvin did what needed to be done with the systematic thoroughness that had built his empire in the first place. The legal processes moved forward. Chioma and Emeka faced charges that the evidence made very difficult to contest, and they did not contest them with much conviction. The sensitive documents that Chioma had been in the process of accessing were secured. The financial architecture of the Okafor business interests was reviewed and reinforced. Emmanuel stepped into that process naturally, learning alongside his father, asking the right questions, earning his place not by inheritance but by attention, which was exactly how his father had always wanted it to happen. The house in Ikoyi changed again. Not dramatically, incrementally, the way a room changes when you open the windows after a long time of keeping them shut. The same room, but breathing differently. There was less performance in it. There was less of the particular tension that Ada had been carrying in her body for months. The exhausting vigilance of someone who knows something is wrong and cannot yet prove it. That tension left her slowly. The way pain leaves after the thing causing it has been removed. You notice its absence more than you noticed its presence, because its presence had become so normal. Kelvin summoned her to his study on a Friday afternoon, 3 weeks after Emmanuel's return. He asked her to sit, which was not itself unusual, but the quality of his attention as she settled into the chair across from his desk was different from any she had seen before. He looked at her the way you look at someone you owe something to, and he did not look away. He said, "Ada, I want to ask you something, and I need you to answer me honestly." She said she would. He said, "How long did you know?" She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I did not know, sir. I suspected. There is a difference." He considered this. Then he nodded once. The slow nod of a man who understands the distinction and respects it. He said, "The difference between your suspicion and my ignorance is the difference between my life and something else." She did not answer. She did not need to. What came next was not a transaction. Kelvin was not a man who settled debts with checks the way others settle them with words. He had spent the preceding weeks thinking, with the same focused attention he brought to every serious matter, about what gratitude looked like when the thing you were grateful for was irreducible, when no amount of money could actually match what had been given to you, because what had been given to you was your continued existence, which is not something you can put a figure against. He had thought about what Mary would have done. He had spoken to Emmanuel about it. He had made some inquiries. What Ada received was not merely compensation, it was reorientation. A property in a part of Lagos that she would never have reached on her own, clean titled and fully paid. A capital sum that rewrote the mathematics of her life entirely. And something that surprised her more than the property, more than the money, an introduction, through Kelvin's network, to a woman who ran a small but serious catering company and was looking for a partner with the right instincts for the work. Ada had fed this household for 6 years with a consistency and quality that anyone who had eaten her food would never forget. Kelvin had noticed. He had been noticing for years. He had simply never said so, which was perhaps the one failure of generosity in an otherwise decent record. Ada sat in that study and received all of this and said very little, which was entirely characteristic. She did not cry, which surprised Kelvin slightly. She sat with it, which did not surprise him at all. And then she said quietly a thing that he would repeat to his son that evening and that Emmanuel would remember for the rest of his life. She said, "Sir, I didn't do it for this." He said he knew. She said, "I did it because you were always good to me." He said, "I know that too." Then she said thank you, and he said no, and she stood and left, and Kelvin sat in the study alone for a while and thought about his life, and felt, for the first time since Mary, that he was inhabiting it fully again. This is the story of Kelvin and Ada Chukwu, not the story the tabloids told, which was about betrayal and arrest and the downfall of a beautiful schemer. The real story. The one underneath. The one about what kindness costs and what it returns, and the astonishing, compounding interest that decency pays when you have been practicing it long enough that it becomes simply who you are. Chioma had studied Kelvin for months. She had mapped his finances, his habits, his routines, his vulnerabilities. She had understood, with the cold precision of someone who only looks at people for what they can provide, a great deal about what he had. The one thing she had not accounted for, the one variable that dismantled everything, was who he was, the way he had treated a woman whose name most people in his circle would not have known. The kitchen conversations on Sunday afternoons. The questions about the mother in Enugu. The basic, uncalculated human decency of a man who believed, at some level, that was too deep to be strategic, that everyone around him deserved to be seen. That was what she missed, and that was what cost her everything. The lesson does not need to be stated loudly, it states itself. But if it must be put into words, let it be these. You never know who is standing between you and the worst thing that could happen to you. You never know which relationship, which small act of consideration, which remembered name or asked question or moment of genuine attention is quietly building something that will one day hold you up when you have no idea you are falling. Kelvin was not good to Ada because he expected it to save his life. He was good to her because it was the right way to be. And the universe, which keeps better accounts than any of us realize, returned the investment with interest. Be good to people, all people, not because of what they can do for you, but because you are not actually sure, in this unpredictable and quietly interconnected world, what they already are, now, before you go. This story deserves more than a silent scroll. If something in Kelvin's story made you think about your own life, about the people you see every day without really seeing them, about the kindnesses you have given or withheld, about the Adas in your own world who may be watching over you in ways you have never thought to notice, leave a comment below. Tell us what moved you. Tell us what you will do differently. Subscribe if this channel gave you something worth carrying. Share this story with someone who needs to hear it today. Because stories like this are not meant to be consumed alone, they are meant to travel, and you are exactly the person to send this one forward. See you on the next one.